Today I'm going to do a little video on an introduction to Swift, which is a really cool object-oriented programming language. And I'm going to be working in the IDE Xcode, which is only available on Macs. So if you're going to use Swift for app development, you're probably going to eventually be working with a Mac. But if not, there are a few online versions of Swift that you could use if you've got a Windows computer. And one of them is online.swiftplayground.run, and you can do a playground or a place to try out different commands in Swift in an online environment. So I've got a little print hello world that's like the hello world that everyone starts with a new language, and it'll show your display down here. The first thing you might notice about Swift is, unlike some other programming languages like C and C++, you don't need a semicolon at the end of every line. I'm going to move back over to Xcode. If this is your first time on a Mac and you're not really sure if you have Xcode installed or not, I'd recommend going to the App Store and then searching for Xcode, and it should look something like this. The ratings aren't very good for Xcode, but it really is the best tool if you're going to be doing development with apps using Swift. So go ahead and download that and open it. And when Xcode opens, it looks like this. There used to be a link right at the beginning screen to open what's called a playground. Now you're going to have to go to File at the very top, New, and Playground. And I'd recommend, if this is your very first day working with Swift, instead of trying to do app programming and Swift at the same time, just start with a blank playground. So I'm going to leave blank selected and hit next, give it some kind of a name. I think I've already got one called Playground, so I'll just give it a different name. And then now it's a great environment for you to just test out a few commands at a time. I'm not going to be using this library, so I don't need to import it. So we've got hello playground as a default. That's the variable that's created. And if I wanted to print that, I could just add the word print. And I'm adding the word print, and notice it's trying to help me fill in, yeah, a print is what I want. I'm just going to say print greeting. That's their default variable. And for all your playgrounds, you're going to notice right below the last line that you've typed, there's a little button you can click on to run this playground, and you'll see the output at the bottom, hello playground. So let me create another variable of a different type. So this one, I'll just do X because programmers love short variable names. And I'm going to do X is equal to 5, and then I can print X. And then again, I'll hit that little run button, and now I see that the print statement works whether you're passing in an int, a float, a string. Swift does, once you've set the data type for a variable, it is going to stay that data type. So if X is an integer, I can't all of a sudden set it to a string. If I try to print this, I was expecting an error. Yeah, can't assign a value of string to type int. What if you've got a new variable, and it's var for variable, and the variable will do y, and you don't have an initial value for it? Maybe you're going to read it in for the user, from the user or something. So in this case, this should generate another error. We need to tell what data type it is. So we're not forced to put an initial value in, but putting an initial value lets it figure out the data type. It can deduce the data type based on the fact that you set it to a string, so greeting must be a string. You set this to 5, so X must be an int. So another way to do it, if you don't want to give it an initial value, is to do a colon and specify the data type. So I'm just going to say float. It's still, before I try to print it, I still really should set it equal to something. So I'm going to purposely not put a space. Like you notice with X, I put a space before and after the equal sign. In some languages, it's kind of optional where you would put those spaces. I'm going to try to run this here and see if there's any errors. There's actually an error right here. It's getting a little bit confused by this. So let me put in some spaces and hit run. And now it's able to figure it out. So we were setting y to 3.14, and I'm printing out my string, my int, and my float. What if you don't want to have a new line character after each of these things you're printing? As a default, you might notice it's going to the next line, and you can see over here to the right, it's actually putting that \n or the new line character in. If you don't, you can say you want the terminator character to be, and I'm going to say nothing after greeting, or maybe a space. Let's do a space. After this one, I could say the terminator is maybe a bunch of stars. And then now if I run it, I'm going to see instead of the 3 lines, it's all going to be on the same line. Okay, that's enough with print statements. We'll keep using them in the other examples, but I want to talk about the difference between a variable that has var at the beginning and something else you'll see in Swift, which is let. So I'm going to have one variable, x1, that's let, and we'll make it just an int, and another variable, x2, well, that is var instead of let. So the difference is var stands for variable. If you've got a var variable, you can change it. I can say x2 is equal to x2 plus 1. I can even abbreviate that and say plus equal to 1. And now I can print x2 and I can see that I've added not 1 but 2 to x2 and I'm printing 9. Let's see what happens if I do the same thing and try to change x1. Let's do x1 is x1 maybe minus 5, and I'm going to make my well, the spacing shouldn't matter there. And notice we get an error. So let is a constant. You cannot change it. Once you've set your let variable, you can't change it, so this kind of line's not going to work. Let's jump into if statements. So again, it'd be good to have a variable. Let me do a var instead of a let, because I want to be able to change a variable. So let's say we've got our initial sum is 0, and again I'm going to just put some spaces around that, and I'm first going to do a for loop and say for x is going to be my loop counter variable, x in, and my first value is going to be 1, and then I'm going to do 3 dots and then 10. And then some curly braces, and the convention I've seen most often is the curly brace on the same line with the for loop and a curly brace at the end of the loop. And I'm going to say sum is equal to sum plus x, so we'll have our running total, and every time through the loop x is going to get a different value. So I'm going to print every time we go through the loop what's our x value. And then at the end of all that, what's our sum when we add together all those numbers 1 through 10. Oops, my print statement's missing a opening parenthesis. Let's go ahead and run this. And first we end up printing 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, etc. all the way to 10. So this is the beginning and the ending number, and those are both included in, and we go through the for loop once where x is 1, another time where it's 10, and then my grand total, my sum, is 55. It's kind of hard to read this as is, so I'm going to change this to say sum is equal to, and one way that you could print out a string and an integer on the same line is like this. And I'll go ahead and run, and now my last line is going to say sum is equal to 55. It's a lot easier to read. Okay, so that's an example of a for loop. Let's do an example of a while loop. So I'm going to start out with my loop counter variable. I'll just do a this time and say a starts out at 1, and while a is less than, we could do less than or equal to, I'll do less than 11. Then I want to go ahead and print a, and every time through the loop we want to add 1 to a. So this time I'll do the plus equals. And we run this. Oops, let's see, I need to put a space in there and then try running it. And it worked this time, and we are getting 1 through 10 printing out there. Okay, let's put a little example of an if statement up here for you. So I can do an if statement if a is less than 0, and then I can do some curly braces and print a is negative. And This should work. And print out A is negative. And remember how I said you had to have the spaces on this assignment statement? And if we try it, it's not going to work from my initial assignment statement. Well, let's try removing the spaces for the condition that true or false statement is A less than 0, and we're going to find out that this actually does work. So that's not a problem here. I just threw up another example showing an if, else if, and else. So if I have 3 pets and I add 1, then this condition pets is greater than 3 is true. So we'll print you have more than 3 pets. If I change it and get rid of the +1, now I only have 3 pets. So I run it and it should say you have exactly 3 pets. And let's go ahead and subtract 2 from this, and I'm going to put a space before and after the subtraction sign and go ahead and run it, and it should say you have less than 3 pets. So that's an example of if, else. This is getting pretty long. My next video on Swift I want to cover functions and classes. Good luck, happy programming.